Hi. All right. Thank you so much for being here. I do speak Ukrainian. I promise. No, I don't, sadly. So I'm going to try to speak slow, and I'm going to try to share. I gather everybody speaks English, but please just raise your hand if you don't understand something, or maybe I say a word you don't understand. Just let me know. And first, I want to say I'm so appreciative to be here. So and that you're all here. It's so amazing to see so many people signed up. I really value just getting this time to share with you, to learn with you, share some of my perspective. And I also want to thank the organizers, especially the people who just all reorganized everything. Tanya was one of the women that helped us, so we're very lucky. There's a lot going on. And I feel pretty stoked to be here in Kiev and at this conference particularly. This is my first time here. It's always great. I've been to almost over 50 countries, but learning, networking, meeting people, this is the kind of lifeblood of the global community that we have, to learn from each other. So I hope that I can talk to you later, learn a little more about who you are. As Yaroslav mentioned, my name's David. I'm a design researcher, which means I help companies understand users and their customers. I do this mostly based on sort of naturalistic insight to optimize experiences. And so I've done over hundreds of interviews, and I'm really passionate about using human intelligence. This is what I refer to as human intelligence. I especially do most of my work by spending time with people, observing them, hanging out with them, talking to them, watching them. And I've worked on a few growth and insights teams, fashion houses, banks, some startups, also at Atlassian, the makers of Jira and Trello. And actually, a lot of what you can learn is open sourced here today. A lot of these learnings is in Atlassian's playbook, for example. But today I'll be sharing with you some of my favorite ways to ask questions. I'll be also sharing some of the resources where you can learn more. I don't work at Atlassian anymore. Right now I work at Dropbox. This is actually a poster from our office highlighting our design values. I'm a design practitioner. And I work on a tool called Dropbox Paper. So in case you're not familiar with it, Dropbox Paper is a new type of document designed for creative work. It helps you collaborate in real time and brainstorm ideas. This has been sort of my spiel, you know. I think it's really fucking cool. So that's a little about me. This is a workshop, which means I'd like us to participate. We're going to be doing things like talking to each other in small groups, practicing things. And so I'd like to learn a little more about you. I think the benefit of these conferences is to meet new people and to network. So really briefly, we're just going to go around and say what your name is, where you work, is it like a startup or an enterprise, and what's inspiring you right now. So one thing that's really inspiring you. So just really briefly, one sentence or less, and I'm going to start right here. And each person, just very quickly, your name, where you work, and what's inspiring you right now. And if nothing is inspiring you right now, come talk to me after. I can give you some things to inspire you, because that's sad. All right, so let's start.
Okay, should I stand up?
Sure, yes, please stand up.
Cool. Hi everyone, my name is Lydia. I'm from Apply.io. It's a startup. We're building the sales distribution platform. And what inspires me is the traveling, because you meet people, discovering new places.
Cool. All right. Just really quick.
Hey, my name is Daniel. I'm from UT, and the team that I'm working with inspires me.
Hey, my name is Henry, and I'm from EPAM, and I think people inspire.
Cool. All right, we'll go here, this stage. Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Dima. I am from Ideals. We are a B2B company working with secure documents. Inspiring me, traveling, music, technology, product management, and a lot of other things.
Cool.
Thanks.
Yeah, nice.
I'm Minka. I'm from Real Life, it's a startup for life story in 20 countries. And our customers inspire me because they're
Hi everybody, my name is Julia. I'm working for Setup. It's a Netflix for apps. inspiring people inspire me a lot.
Hey guys, my name is Roman. I'm from CloudMate. We are not a startup anymore, but we are kind of not still yet in enterprise. We are doing the innovation in automotive industry, and what I'm inspired by to see the results of my innovative work, like people driving those personalized intelligent cars in 5-6 years.
Hi, my name is Sergey. I'm working at U-Team, a B2B marketplace for development work. And actually, among other things, our customers inspire me.
Hi everyone, my name is Lina. I'm from Ideals. Usually people inspire me and doing sports inspire me. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Vlad, I'm also from Ideals, and new opportunities inspired me always.
Cool.
Everyone, my name is Olga. I'm from AIR MCN. We help YouTube bloggers to grow up and influencers as well. Inspires me that big data analysis.
You're not going to learn any big data analysis here, but it inspires me too.
Hi everyone, I'm Vlad, I'm from OX2. My inspiration is create useful products language.
Hi there, my name is Eugene. I'm working in Livingston Research. I'm inspired by good results and growth achievements.
My name is Costa. I work in Type 47, which is a marketing consulting company. So what inspires me probably new projects, new startups, and also like frameworks and tactics that I can learn and later to sell to the clients.
I work in used textbooks marketplace to the USA. What inspired me? I think art.
Right, okay.
Hi everybody, my name is Maria. I'm working in software, big enterprise outsourcing company, and things that inspire me. Music, first of all, especially rock music, sport competitions, and cool people as you are.
My name is Misha. I'm the product manager for Dream Team. We are a startup in the esports space. What inspires me is a huge, fast-growing market of the esports.
Hey everyone, my name is Vlad. I work at Riddle also, together with Agnes. And what inspires me are people who are zagging when the rest is zigging.
Awesome.
Hi, my name is Kate. I work for Prep.com. This is an educational marketplace for online tutoring, and I'm inspired by fashion, art, vehicle, traveling, and many, many other things.
Hey, I'm Eugene. I'm from BigCommerce. It's a SaaS e-commerce platform, and I'm inspired by like solving some real problems and challenging tasks. Okay.
I'm Ksenia from CloudMate. We're building intelligent solutions for automotive business, and I'm really inspired by opportunity of changing the world a little bit by building exciting products.
Hi everyone, my name is Anton. I'm head of UX design in Australian fintech company Exicorp, and I'm inspiring by creating whatever. Thank you.
All right, few last ones over here.
Hey guys, I'm a product manager at Tickets.Wake. We're the largest online travel agency in Wake. My main source of inspiration is probably serving others, bringing value, and seeing live customers.
Hi everyone, my name is Costa. I'm from Lalafo. We are C2C AI-based marketplace in 4 countries. And I'm inspired by design thinking approach, what we apply often in our company. That's why I'm here.
Hi everyone, my name is Sophie. I am the CEO and founder of startup Let's Enhance. And we build AI tools to automate processing of visual content.
And what inspires me is all the hustle that's happening in the AI industry. I really am a big believer that it will change the world in the next couple of years.
Nice.
Hey guys, I'm Andrei and I'm General Product Manager at Yola.com. It's a site building platform with more than 15 million users worldwide. What inspires me? So I guess I'm inspired with nature, people, I mean humanity, so I like to learn them and improve them.
Yeah. All right. So you might be wondering why I asked for us to do something like this. I think it's really important that we get to know each other, but also that we find out what we're all interested in. I think what I would encourage you is during the break and after this, maybe go up to someone you don't know, and now that you have some similar interests, kind of find and learn a little more about them. And this is kind of inherent to the process of interviews. It's kind of hard to go and approach someone, start talking to them, and try to gain more information and learn things. And it can be hard to ask questions if you don't know anything about someone. So it's kind of a little way for us to get started. But let's also kind of talk a little about why we're here. Can someone tell me why did they come to this workshop? Before I kind of tell all the information, I'm curious to hear from you.
To improve onboarding experience for our users.
Okay, to improve, you want to improve, I'm going to call that NUX. Have you guys heard that? New User Education Experience, Onboarding Experience? Okay? Shorthand. I'll get into it. Why else are we here?
Because most of my team are engineers, and my role is to make sure they're building something useful for the clients.
Okay. What else? Aha! Ask the right questions. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to say, this is great. We are here to learn all of these things. But at this, I would say here, asking the right questions, this is the approach that we take to ladder up, to build useful things, to improve sort of the education experiences, onboarding experiences. This workshop will not make your onboarding experience better. This workshop will help you ask the right questions for you to build the things to make it better. So that's a little on why we're here. But again, the purpose of this workshop is to help you improve your interviews, to help you become more comfortable. I'm going to cover some of the basic topics. And if you want more information, raise your hand like this and ask. Which brings me to my last question for you. Who has done an interview here? Please raise your hand. Whew! Everybody. All right. Well, we're just going to be doubling down on skills. We're going to learn how to ask some better questions. I'm going to give some examples. And then we're going to practice, because sometimes you don't get a chance to practice interviewing. So that's what we're going to do today. What I'm not going to do is turn you into an expert overnight. I've still been studying interviews for years, almost 7 years, and I would not claim to be the expert. Think of this kind of like the start to our journey together. I hope if you've done interviews, which all of you have, that you can help. Because interviews, like most complex things, seem easy to understand. You just talk to someone, right? But it's actually a lot harder. So let's slowly get into it. Before I give you the agenda, a story about this man. I heard you recently had an election. We too have a comedian for president. Many said he couldn't win. You know, most of the predictions that were made in the media beforehand were based on things like big data and analytics. They were based on focus groups and surveys. I think a lot of the media kept saying he couldn't win because they didn't spend time doing interviews, maybe. Or they didn't spend time doing deep observation. They didn't spend time in the center of America, where some people don't get surveyed. Or they don't spend time looking at the analytics that aren't there. But it can be very hard to talk to people we don't know. And many people say to me, oh, well, interviews are small n, small information. But what I would say is that all methods matter. I hope this is a correct translation, my gosh. All methods matter when we're trying to grow our business. So we need to be doing things like interviews, collecting anecdotes, collecting stories, and then pair that data with analytics. So I wouldn't say just do interviews, But what I would say is use the interviews to start doing things like surveys, because interviews can help you make better survey questions, and that they can help also pair with your surveys. Who's familiar with the must-have survey? Okay, 1, 2, a few of you. This is a survey created by Sean Ellis. Sean was an advisor at Dropbox, and he has a great book called Hacking Growth. And the must-have survey is a pretty basic survey. Basically, it's testing for product market fit. If over 40% said very disappointed, then what you would have is product market fit. But we don't always have product market fit. So when we see that we don't have that, what we may need to do is dig in. We do interviews. And this is the point where you can see a link between surveys and interviews. So I'm not here to talk about surveys. I'm here to talk about interviews. And here's the agenda. Basically, we're going to do some interview basics. There will be 2 exercises, I warn you. Okay? One of them is quiet, reflection. We'll be doing some writing. The other one, we'll be doing some talking in a group setting. And the other one, lastly, we're going to lead up after the bathroom to practice. And then I also want to leave some time for Q&A, because that's the main benefit. Okay? Any questions before we get started? Okay. Basics. Who can tell me the difference between an interview and a conversation? What's the difference? Structure. May you say more about that?
Like interview should be structured, and conversation is not structured and not predictable.
Not predictable?
Like the one side is asking questions and the other like answering them.
Okay.
Ratio between like activity. I mean, when we have a conversation, probably we are speaking 50-50.
Yeah.
And if we have an interview, like somebody more listens and somebody more speaks.
Okay. Before I get to the next hand, let's just recap what we just said. So we said ratio, structure. What else? Maybe one last thing. We're going to start here, and then we'll go back. One more. What did you say?
The goal.
The goal, yes. Awesome. Goal. Last one. One person back there.
Maybe a format. Like,
Sorry?
Maybe format.
Format. Yeah. Okay, so all of these things. I think that it's important for us when we're talking about interviews to ground ourselves in this big difference. Conversation, interactive communication between 2 people. Interview, most basically, at its most basic, you're asking questions, people are giving answers. But there's a finesse and there's an art form to how we create that balance that's honest and beautiful with people. It's also important to remember some interviews can be remote, so we can be calling people or we can be doing it from like Skype or whatever your tool is, Zoom. But they can also be contextual, so they can be in the moment when someone is working on something. Sometimes people ask me, when should I use interviews in the part of user research in a study? If we think about the landscape of user research, maybe down here on the bottom right is where we have analytics. Basically, you're looking at, or on the top right, sorry, what people do and how much of it. Where are they clicking? What kind of screens are they on? On the bottom right, you might be thinking about surveys. So how much of something is happening with people? And on the top left, maybe you're doing things like usability testing and checking out how useful your product is. Interviews are squarely in this left-hand side of why and how and what people are saying. So interviews are best suited, and we should be doing interviews when we ask why questions. And they can be very useful to gather when gathering very detailed information, complex topics, or studying processes. Is anyone familiar with Febreze here? This is an American brand. Okay. Febreze, basically, it's something you spray to make the air smell better. So Febreze did hundreds of interviews with people to better understand and find out what was the cleaning experience like? Why do you clean? Here they were trying to get at the heart of what matters to people, what they need, before even asking them about how they use their product. And what they found was people talked about the little celebration of feeling, how good it feels after you clean a place. So they rooted a lot of their marketing in the notion of creating a celebration. And they were able to increase sales by millions of dollars doing this. So interviews can be good for marketing. They can also be good for pricing. Trader Joe's, a market in the United States, interviewed people about how they purchase bananas. The ways that they purchased them differed in terms of the amount of bananas together. Some people wanted only one banana, and they would be willing to pay more for one banana than buying a cluster. So now they sell all bananas as one banana. And tomorrow I'll be telling you a story about how I've used interviews to redesign the flow of an insurance website. But the way that we make interviews really matters. And I know you're like, all right, let's get into it. Let's talk about it. But let's slow down. When thinking about interviews, there's a lot of different things going on. There's planning, there's conducting, there's reflecting, and there's acting. So this is the kind of general approach that we're taking to interviews. So let's talk a little about the planning stage. So first off, when we're doing interview research, we need to think about the way that we plan out our interview research. You can think about interview research or doing interviews in two ways. It can be maybe a little more strategically oriented. So in this case, you are actually planning out a specific study and saying, I'm going to interview 6 to 12 people to learn more about this one topic. Or they can be continuous. I'm going to be doing interviews every week with my customers or users. What I'm trying to underline and indicate is that when we start a business or when we're working in one, what we shouldn't do is just start interviewing people. We need to sit down and make a plan. And we need to sometimes consider a number of questions. Like, so why are you even doing these? What big question are you trying to answer? How many people will you interview? Because you can interview hundreds of people. And sometimes you need to just start building shit. But you need to think about all of these things. How long will you spend doing this? Is 1 month okay, or is 1 week? And what will you give people in exchange for their time? Are you paying them? Or are you giving them access to your product? What is the mutual benefit that we're creating together when doing these interviews? And then what are you going to do about the information? Sometimes it's useful to grab a piece of paper and put a marker and put on the left-hand side, when I learn this, I will do this. Because stating our intention beforehand enables us to use interview data in a way that is much more actionable than when we just start talking to people. Okay, so we make a plan because, I'll be frank, I love interviews, but interviews aren't sometimes the best option. Sometimes you shouldn't be doing interviews. There are better things to be doing. If your goal is about asking why questions, then this is a good time to do interviews. Here's some example of some big questions you might want to ask. Maybe when you're trying to understand your users. Who are they? This is a good time to do interviews. What motivates them? Nothing to do with your product, but you're trying to build if you're a product manager or you're a researcher or you're a designer, inherently you're building the future. And so you need to think about what motivates them about outside of how they use the product. Or maybe you have a great product, but some people stopped using it. That's okay. We need to understand why. Why did they stop using it? Sometimes the why is the most simple and obvious fix that you can make. And the only way that you can get a very detailed response is by doing interviews. Sometimes I find it useful to start with a hypothesis of like, we believe users will do this or that, and if we know that, then we'll do this. Here's an example of from an insurance company that I worked with where we believed, or the startup believed, switching insurance online is a better experience than going to the actual broker. In Paris, a few years ago, this actually wasn't the truth. People didn't believe that, but the startup believed that. And we said, if we understand why drivers switch, then we can redesign our sign-up flow to suit their needs. We said, maybe we'll learn about this by talking to young drivers. The key question here, like I said, is why? But also young drivers. Who are young drivers? How are we going to find them? So a big part of interviews as well is finding the right people. How do you find, those of you who have done your interviews before, I saw a lot of people, how do you find the people that you interview? Where do you find them?
Current user audience.
Let's do one at a time.
Current user base.
Current user base.
The same customers.
Customers.
Sales, from sales.
From sales.
Customers.
Yeah.
By reference.
By reference. Okay.
Some communities.
Some communities.
Discord, some communities.
Yeah.
Competitors, customers.
Competitors, customers. Yeah. These are all good places to find people. I think when on the two hands of looking and thinking about these things, though, when you think about your current customers, sometimes it's useful to think about how will, like, let's take, if you don't mind sharing. When you talk about current customers, how do you choose which current customers to talk about?
Okay, we have a segmentation. And
Segmentation.
That, for instance, I have a question and I want to check this question and answer it to some of the segment. Yeah. And I have some hypothesis.
Yeah.
And I could even have even more narrow segment. I mean, by age and something like that. And after that, I'm making some query to database, some analytic, get some emails, and so on, and continue.
This is definitely one of the best and easiest ways to get our customers. But sometimes what's hard is to get people who are not customers, people who are outside of the sales pipeline. This is when it becomes challenging because these are the best people to do interviews with. So Tomer Sharon, a man I really respect, he wrote a book called Validating Product Ideas. He talks about 43 ways to find these more difficult participants. Ways that we can do this are pretty basic, but let me just underline them for you. If you're in a business-to-business environment, going to LinkedIn and starting by what's called snowball sampling in academic terms is a great place to do this. You might go to a specific business community, find one individual, and then snowball from them of the particular types of people. You can do the same thing with LinkedIn, the same cohort segmentation as you do on LinkedIn. So you can start to say, I only want these types of people, and you can build your own database of these potential users or potential customers. Or maybe you work more in a consumer-friendly area. Coffee shops are a great place, but sometimes better places are shopping malls. So if you work on a specific type of startup, maybe it's a retail startup, your future competitors are here sometimes. And so going and hanging out literally inside or outside of their shops is a great place to start to find your potential users. Again, this is not customer development. You are not here to sell your product. You're here to learn from people. And coming at them with that generosity and that curiosity will help you learn a lot and improve your product. What about outside of these areas? Maybe you work in a more academic field, or maybe you're trying to do something like with families. The library is a surprising great place to start. You can literally go to the section of the library where your topical area is and spend time hanging out there, talking to people, but also offering to do interviews later. And lastly, you can do things like going to schools. Maybe you have a young product base, or maybe you want to talk to families. Again, going to universities, making connections with professors, being able to introduce yourself to classrooms is a great way to start to build your own database of people to do interview research with. There's also emerging existing online resources. Let's say you have an international base and you want to talk to very specific like developers in Poland. Pingpong.com, hello pingpong.com, and Respondent.io are two databases of places where you have lots of people who are willing to do research with and learn from. And again, maybe you have people that are not your existing customers, but you can also go back onto your website. You know, here we see like an intercept on Growth Marketing's website. A lot of the times we use this again for customer development. But another way is to source people who, if you find out they aren't your existing customer, what happens if you flip the tables on them? You offer to give your product for free to someone in exchange for an in-depth interview, or to give them some of your time or your expertise with the product. Recruiting can be a challenging thing, and so we need to think a little critically about how we structure our approach, keeping it short and sweet, starting about how you're going to think about the incentive is very important. And depending on if you come, say, from like a more consumer background or maybe a more traditional academic background, you might choose to do different ways of recruiting. Maybe it's formal, or maybe it's informal. So this leads us to our first exercise. This is the quiet reflection one. Everybody has a piece of paper here. I'd like you to grab a piece of paper. And let's think a little about the future of your product. Let's think about the people you want to use your product, to acquire, those people you want to acquire, those people that maybe you want to sell to, and maybe you don't have a sales pipeline right now. Think a little about, and let's put some bullet points on the piece of paper that says, well, what way would you find them? Who could you find? Where would you go to find them? How would you incentivize them? And what path would you choose in terms of that? And then also maybe what's hard about this? Or if it's easy, what's stopping you from doing it right now? So let's just take 2 minutes, 2 minutes, to reflect on how you're approaching that, what you're doing, and why. Okay. So, let's slowly come back together. See if you of you are still writing. Who said that they would go to Facebook? Raise your hand if you're going to go to Facebook to find your users. Okay, a few of you. I wouldn't go to Facebook. Why? Why? Good question. Because Facebook. So why? So who did you say Facebook by chance? No. Okay. So I guess maybe someone who said Facebook. Maybe tell me a little about why you would go to Facebook.
Yeah, Facebook. So Dream Team is a platform for gamers.
Sorry, maybe speak it. Dream Team is a platform for gamers.
For gamers, yes, and we need to recruit people who play new games.
Play new games.
Yeah, Apex, and they have some communities on Facebook where they search each other, like players whom to play with.
Okay.
So I'm going to go there and type some message and recruit this way.
Okay. Could be a very good way. I'm not saying I wouldn't always go to it. Who else would go to Facebook? Why did you say that? Okay.
Yeah, because we are a live streaming company, and our customers are streaming to Facebook, so basically it's their habitat, natural habitat.
Natural habitat.
So catching them there. Maybe they won't be on the street or somewhere else because they're hanging out on Facebook, so I'm hanging out there as well.
Yeah. Cool. So Facebook, actually, I'll take it back. Facebook can be a great place. I don't go to Facebook because I think twofold. One is that I don't have a Facebook account. But no, I'm kidding. Two is the reason I'm saying this is because Facebook can sometimes be the default option. In some cases, there are existing communities and groups on Facebook. But some of the most passionate people who are really passionate about subjects, are sometimes also off of Facebook in their own niche community areas. Going out and doing the hard work to find those people is also part of the interview process. Finding where they hang out outside of the sort of like bigger platforms is part of gaining access to a community and learning about where they hang out so that you can actually have participants who are a little more engaged, who have a lot more experience, and who can give you richer information. But it's okay, we can go to Facebook, but it's important that we just think about where are the other places that we can go to interview people. When we go to interview people, it's all good. We got all those participants, good to go. Maybe we're doing them with customers. What's really important is to think about how we do the interview. Again, thinking about that structure. So interviews can be in 3 ways. Interviews can be structured, which means that they can be scripted. Literally, you write down every single question and every single thing you're going to say. This is great if maybe you're less confident with people. But sometimes maybe they can be more semi-structured. This is like a discussion guide that I anonymized from a previous study. This would be more semi-structured. I haven't written everything. And sometimes it can be unstructured. So you might just list out a series of topics that you want to talk about. All of them are okay. But what we should be thinking about is the flow of our interviews. So there's different facets of what we're trying to learn here. But when we're thinking about the flow of interviews, I find that the best ways that we can learn from people is by starting by building rapport. So we don't just go straight up to, say, someone who stopped using our product and say, why'd you stop using our product? What we start with is building a little rapport. We maybe learn a little of the factual elements, things that are easier for them to answer and reply to. This helps us get going in an environment that can help establish and say, I'm the interviewer and you're the interviewee. This is how we start an interview. Then you might go into information gathering. This is a great place and way to start to follow your nose. And this is what we'll learn a little more about with some of the questions. But what you're trying to do is do some perspective, get some needs, some context. And then what you'd like to do is to do what's called snowballing as well. Not only do you want to thank them, but you should ask, this is a great time to say, who else can I talk to in your community or group that will help me learn about this subject? Some considerations when information gathering. So I mentioned information gathering is the bulk of this interview. What you might want to be learning about is by starting with their perspective. How do they see the world? What are the ways that they understand it? Like computers, all humans have an operating model. How they grew up, where they came from. This will impact their values and what they care about. It's also useful to learn a little about their goals and their needs. So this could be related to your product, but it could also be about other products, what other challenges they're facing. And lastly, you might want to learn about the context of these things. What are their habits? How often do they do these things? Questions are both the easiest and hardest thing to do. To ask a good question takes a lifetime. It's what differentiates us as adults from children. Asking a good question and getting information from that question is key. And there are so many different ways that we can ask questions. So these are just a few. Actually, down in this link is a colleague I really respect, Steve Portugal. He has a whole book on this of how to ask these questions. But let's just look at a few of these. So we can ask about sequence. What would be an example of asking about sequence?
How often do you do this?
Okay. I might...
It's about quantity.
Tell me the story how you did this.
Yeah, that's a great way. So there's so for example, a question of sequence. Describe your typical workday. What would you do when you first sit down at your desk? Again, these all matter depending on what you're asking in your business context. Or quantity, yeah. How many files did you delete when that happened? Or maybe you might ask for specific examples. This is the richer way to get information. So instead of, what movies do you stream? You might want to say, what was the last movie that you streamed? This can then help you open up to learn about their streaming behavior. And it helps people actually remember what they stream. Because they might say, well, I stream a little of this, a little of that. Or you can ask for what's called a complete list. This might be something like, what are all the different apps that you have installed on your smartphone right now? This then can help you get a series of follow-ups. What else? Why that? You can ask for clarification. When you refer to that server, what do you mean by that? Is that the newest server? Or you might say there might be code words that you don't understand. Again, this can help you unpack information, like why do you call it the Bat Cave? So again, what we'll do is, and one of our goals was how to ask the right questions. We're going to practice trying to get some of these questions. And while I'd say that there's no such thing as a stupid question, I will say there are such things as better questions or right questions. So what we don't want to be doing is asking what are called closed questions. We don't want to be asking double-barreled questions for future behavior, about a feature, potential payment, or desire. There are ways we ask about these things instead, so I'm going to break it down. Closed versus open question. This is an example of a closed question. Do you like this? What's a better way of saying this?
Yes.
What do you like about this? What about double-barreled versus single-barreled? So when was the last time you did this and who were you with? Breaking it out and doing single questions. When was the last time that you did this? Future behavior versus past example. Instead of asking, would you use this product to do X, or would you do this? You might say instead, tell me about the last time that you did this. Or about a feature. This is arguably a pretty good question. How do you do that, or how do you use this? But it's even better if you say, how does this fit in your workflow? Sometimes we're trying to sell things to people, so we want to know, how much would you pay for this? Well, it's much better if you might say, how much did you pay for that? The last thing, a competitor product, something similar. Or what they would want versus what they want to achieve. Would you use a product that X? It might be better to do, what were you trying to do that X? And while this is pretty simplistic or obvious by looking at, it becomes really hard in the moment to remember to do these things, to not ask those type of closed questions or double-barreled, especially when you're excited. And so this is why it matters to do some type of planning, to train us outside of our behaviors to stop doing this. Before I move on to conducting, does anyone have any questions about questions? No questions about
closed question.
Good point. This is not an interview. Aha. No, I'm just kidding. What were you going to say?
Some recommended time frame for interview. So 1 hour is a lot, 10 minutes is not enough.
Yeah, definitely. So the question to repeat was, what is a good amount of time to do an interview? It really depends on what kind of information you're trying to gather. I think usually I'll give you my different bars. I do 20-minute interviews when trying to gain information about a single topic, something that I really just need to understand. Why did they stop using the product? 20 minutes is a great way to build rapport, get some really detailed information, and stop. When we're building out the 3-year vision of our product and we're trying to understand what motivates our current users, this is a great time to do 90-minute interviews. And that can be really scary. And that's where doing a lot of planning is important. And we'll get into a little some of the techniques that we can do to probe and learn more information as well. But developing a rich set of questions for 90 minutes can take almost a week sometimes to write a good script like that feels natural. But I'd say usually you can err on the side of like 20 minutes to an hour. These are good time frames. And it's really important whenever you're starting an interview to also give that information to the people themselves to say, this is about how long the interview will be. That was a great question.
So how do you build the rapports?
So the question was, how do we build rapport? Rapport? Rapport. That's a very big question.
It's like segmentation. How do you do this? What tools do you use for this?
Yeah, definitely. So rapport, in my mind, rapport is the feeling that we can get from people of having mutual and agreed benefit from our conversation. Building that is a human skill that takes being genuinely interested in them and creating the framework of the interview that enables you to, for them to understand that what you're not trying to do is sell your product or sell yourself. So ways that I do that are by starting out, maybe sharing a little about the purpose. So framing your interview in the context of your purpose is a great way to build rapport. You say, hi, my name's David. The purpose of this interview is to learn more about your educational background. I'm going to ask you a series of questions. So you start by framing that, and then you start with something maybe a little easier, and you say, what else were you doing today before this interview? You kind of start with a framework of the purpose, then you kind of move and catch someone off guard a little. Be a little human. The interview's not the only thing they're doing that day. They don't only care about you. So being genuinely interested enables you to learn more about that. And you've just started by asking your first question. What were you doing before this interview? That is a great way to start to slowly move to your questions, which are a little richer. There's a human art and an art form to socializing that's not covered by this. But we can definitely talk about how to build rapport and techniques like that. But what I'll say is it takes a lot of practice. That's why doing a lot of interviews and taking time to learn more about them can be very helpful. It was a great question. So, one last question before we move on to conducting. Yeah.
What works best when you do one-on-one interview or when you get someone from your team?
Yeah. So the question was, what's best, one-on-one interviews or with someone with your team? This depends. The reason I don't include something like this in a presentation is because it wholly depends on your work environment and the types of people that you're interviewing. But it's a great question, so let's unpack this a little. Most of the time it's best to do one-on-one interviews because this enables you to build rapport, it's natural, and it enables you to learn from someone. But if you work in product development, it's unrealistic. Not only that, it's not the best way for you to action the information because you need more people to see and hear the same things you're hearing to try to challenge what you're learning from. So I'd say usually what I would do is I would try my best to do a single interview with people and I will record it. And we'll get into that so that my team can learn and listen from it. But if you don't have the time or resources to record and analyze it, then I would say usually with one colleague who's a note taker is the best way to go. If you're doing remote calls, this is a great way to have many colleagues. Sometimes we grab lunch while I do an interview, and everybody listens in. So there's great ways that we can do different types, but I generally say doing one-on-one is your best. We're going to move on to conducting interviews. So sometimes you can't write all the questions. This is the art of up-leveling your interviews, doing solid probing techniques. Probing is it helps you get more information. So let me give you 5 examples of ways that you can probe for more information. Asking why 5 times, 5 whys. Basic, but one of the best frameworks that you can use. So let's talk about building a fence. Maybe if you see someone doing something and you're trying to understand from your customers are people who want to, who buy, or you're trying to sell to people wood. You see someone, you say, what are you trying to get done? They say, oh, well, I'm trying to build a fence. And you'd say, why? And they say, I want to surround my front yard. And you might say, why? And they'll say, well, I want to plant a garden. You might say, why? They say, well, I want to grow some food. You say, why? They said, I want to save money on groceries. When asking why, obviously you don't just say why 5 times like that, but get to the heart of it. Remember to ask those 5 whys in different ways will help you get to the heart of someone's problem. The problem isn't they love fences and they want a fence. The problem is they need to save money on groceries. There might be other ways to do that. Let's think of a different way that we can probe. Same problem of fence building. You see someone and you say, what are you trying to get done there? And they say, I'm trying to build a fence. And you can say, well, why is that a problem for you? And they might say, well, my front yard is all open. And they say, why is that a problem? Well, then my garden will get damaged. Why is that a problem? Well, then I'd lose all the food I'm growing. Why is that a problem? Well, it'd be like a waste of time and money. Again, these are ways that we probe because sometimes people don't give us the first answer. And you can sense that. And we need to do it in ways that unpacks this richness. If you're building a product, sometimes it can be hard for someone to explain something to you. Or maybe they struggled with your product. They left and they stopped using it. It wasn't what they expected. In an interview, asking, "May you draw it for me?" might really help you. People might say, "Oh, I don't draw. I'm not very good at that." And you can say, "It's okay, just some stick figures," or maybe a set of boxes and arrows. Asking people to draw for you, relationships, helps them speak about something that might be a little hard for them to speak about. They start explaining while they're drawing. It doesn't look good, but this is what, and what they're doing is providing more information. Or maybe you work in an area where it's really complicated. When I worked for banks, this was one of the hardest things. I never understood anything that was going on. Adopting a humble mindset. Explain it to me like I'm 5 years old. Do you have any kids? Explain it to me like one of your children. This is one of the best ways to start to unpack and help someone understand that you don't understand, and that's okay. There's no shame in not understanding topics. Another technique for probing, maybe someone you're with them at their business place. You might say, "Show me." You're talking about someone, maybe it's screens, they're talking about an app they use. "Oh, may you show me that app? May you show me what's going on there?" Again, this is a rich way to pull out information. Right, so we've got some questions. We're using some probing techniques, but we forgot about one of the most important things. When we do interviews, we always show up as ourselves. We show up with all of our biases, and we need to adopt in interviews what are referred to as opening and listening mindsets. We might expect to hear things we didn't expect to hear, and we could spend a whole day kind of trying to unpack these skills. But what I'd sum it up in is saying to check your bias. We all judge people by the way they dress, the way they look, and when we're talking to them, we need to draw them out. We need to learn from them, and we need to do this because sometimes we don't understand or we don't know who they are when they're not talking to us. We don't know about their past. This is why building rapport matters. This is why asking about things outside of your own product or business area really matters, because it might help you develop some of the richer insight. So there are two ways that we can kind of check your bias. This is pretty simple, right? Listening with your ears. This is called active listening. We do active listening. Who's familiar with the concept of active listening? Okay, great. So again, we do this active listening how? Who can tell us, maybe because we have a lot of people sharing, if you can raise your hand, how do you do your active listening?
So you concentrate on what people say and feel very high interest of his words and pay attention to everything what he says.
Okay. So how do we... Constant feedback, okay. Constant feedback that we're listening. How do we do constant feedback that we're listening?
Nodding. Oh, cool. Great.
Nodding. Okay, that's with your body.
Repeating some sentences that he said, or
okay.
he or she.
Okay, so repeating sentences, yeah. So these are great. So we'll get to the body aspects, but repeating things. These are what's referred to as clarifying questions. So we want to ask by clarifying, but also summarizing. When you ask a question and someone explains something very complicated to you, you might say, "That's really interesting. Let me just make sure I understood that. What you just said was," and then you summarize back. You show people that you're engaged in the conversation, not only with your body, but by verbally repeating it to them. And of course, yes, we should be doing some of the basic things like nodding our head and listening with our body, putting our hands on our face, things like that, smiling, showing interest. Again, these are pretty basic. And we're not only listening with our body, but we should be listening to their body. So what does this kind of posture say? Closed posture. So then as an interviewer, when I see a body posture like this, we need to then flip and think about how will we open them up? What kind of probing questions might make it easier to do that? And there are many different little ways that we can think about body language. Again, you can think about openness versus defensiveness. Putting your hand on your face, if an interview participant does this, sometimes can refer to evaluation or suspicion. Many of these things are natural to product managers, humans, but at the same time, taking a step back to really reflect on them can help you be constantly aware in an interview where you're trying to gain richer information. And so sometimes I've found it useful as I started doing more interviews to even put some of these different things on your piece of paper to help you look and remember, because when you start to talk to someone, they start giving you a lot of information, and it's really hard to pay attention. So having those sort of elements is very important. Now we're going to get into our second little group exercise. Sometimes people are difficult, so talk in a group, maybe for about 2 minutes. How do you think we handle difficult participants? And who can be difficult to interview? Like, what makes them difficult to interview? And then we'll talk about how to open them up. So take like 2-3 minutes in your group here. Talk a little about who are the types of people that are maybe a little more difficult, and how do you open them up? Okay, just for one moment, appoint someone at your table. I'm going to ask a table at random. Appoint someone at your table to be ready to share, who are some of the difficult people that are challenging to interview and how you would handle them. So we'll come back in 1 minute, but just pick one person in your table that's comfortable sharing. Okay, so three, two, one. Let's all come back here. Okay, great, stoked. What did we learn? Let's start maybe back there. Farthest table. Who's hard to interview? Yeah. Share what you talked about. What? That's someone who's hard to interview. No. Who can be challenging to interview? What did you talk about at your table?
Okay, different things. And as for your questions, so what makes a person difficult for us is keeping silence. One person is keeping silence on the interview. Then he or she tells a lot of irrelevant information that particularly has some sense, but not in your case. And when the person is forced to be on the interview by team lead, by his boss, and he or she doesn't want to be there by himself or herself. And when this person is paid for participating in the interview.
People who are paid to be there.
Yes, we think so. And should I tell the second part?
No, you can. We will move to another table. Who had something different than that? Did anyone have any other people?
Yeah. So when people try to generalize their experience, so you try to get back them to real story, to real experience, and they just want to explain you how to do it in an ideal world. So in general, I do it like this, and in this case, it's hard to get a real thing.
Okay.
People who are trying not to offend you.
People are trying not to offend you. Okay. All right. Yes. So how about you start with some people who, some of the ways that you can handle that. What did you guys talk about in that sense, or your table? Okay.
Because we have a bit different categories at first.
Yeah, should add to the first question?
Please add to the first question.
Okay, so to the first question, we thought about if your product is actually for a child, right?
For a child?
Yeah. He is the end user.
Yeah.
But you need to talk to father because he will buy it, right? So those two are different categories.
Different types.
Yeah, so you ask different questions. Also, people with the very busy schedules, they're just hard to find for the interview. And also people who don't answer honestly, who would like to seem to be like cool, right? And then answer those questions as they would like to be in future, but they are not right now. So those 3 ideas.
Okay.
And introverts.
Which is obvious.
Yeah, it's obvious.
Okay. Anyone else that we've missed? Yes, please.
Parents would also add also older people.
Older.
Because they have a different perception of internet and so for the students you're saying it's internet of thinking the same way.
To generalize these partners and older people and add something, it's like different mindset and value set. Yeah. For instance, it could be some Afro-American rapper from Brooklyn, yeah, and you are like a banker, so you are so different.
Yeah.
Yeah, you even use language which is different.
Yep. Okay. Value set. These are all good. Anyone else? Anyone that's missing up here? No. Yeah. Sorry. We'll start here and then we'll go there, and then I'll get you.
Consider people who have some not very good soft skills, maybe arrogant or not very open to speaking.
Okay. So yeah, we'll put just soft skill deficient. Okay.
Different languages when English is not
Languages,
primary
yeah.
language for you and for interviewer, and it's Cyprus, okay.
All right. Languages. Okay. And then one last one we have back there.
Yeah, we call them gift catchers. These are people who offer something instead, and they're gonna say that they love your product, but they don't.
Right. So there's that. It's like kind of with the honesty and like we'll call them incentive driven, yeah, offer driven. I also heard, yeah, incentives we said before. Okay. We could go all day. People are challenging to interview. That's why we need to constantly think about their skills. I can share my perspective on how I might address some of these different facets or challenges that we face, but they might not work. For every person, it's different of how you build those approach. But I do want to address 2 things. One is incentives. I often provide incentives for my interviews. I value people's time, especially in a work environment when your product is B2B. It's really important. And I personally and fundamentally don't believe that valuing someone's time is going to change the nature of their results, especially if I ask them to give me those honest critique and answers. So I think that it's important that whatever approach you take, you think about what's honest to you. But for me, I honestly value that. I will say yes, so for all people who are offer-driven or they're trying to tell you they like your product, I think that this is a great thing though. When someone is expressing dishonesty or saying they really love it when you sense that they don't, this is a great way to probe. Learn about the differences. This is where your expertise as a human comes in to say, oh, I sense some differences. For example, I was interviewing someone once who said, I love your product, Dropbox Paper, so great. May you show me an example of a document that you've made on Dropbox Paper? Well, I can't find it. Why can't you find it? Is it a problem of the findability? This is where, again, we're starting to build in the contrast of what we can learn from people. With regarding, say, kids, oh yes, please.
So, I'm not saying people lie, but during your interview, if you see the people lying, you like soften saying, okay, maybe it's your time, you're not fully correct, right? So to keep relations, you're not pushing them to accept that they're lying and not using your.
Yeah, great question. People lie. All the time. We all lie. From different levels of lying, of course. But everyone lies. And our job as researchers, or my job as a researcher, and when you assume the role of an interviewer, is to check your bias and to understand for that person, even if you might see it as lying, maybe they honestly, even if it is a lie, honestly don't believe it's a lie. Or maybe for them, they have a different value spectrum of, oh, they don't want to say something. What I would say is, again, dig into the lie itself to better understand what drives it. Why are they lying about that? And that's sometimes the most interesting thing you can learn, is when they're more uncomfortable with something. And again, that's trying to be curious and learn from them. With regard to kids, this can be very difficult. Again, I think we could probably park that topic for another time. But what I will say is children pick up their value systems from their parents. And so learning from the parents can be a good indication of how the child will see the world. Introverts and silence. That kind of slowly leads me to the slide where we talk about this. There's many different types of difficult participants. I would say that I would categorize 4. The monosyllabic, or what's referred to as the one-word participant. Yes. No. Okay. I find the best way to work with these type of people in an interview is to be silent. If you've framed the purpose of your interview, maybe you're giving them your product or an incentive, maybe you're here to help them. If someone gives you an answer that's 1 or 2 words, one of the most uncomfortable and hard things that I will ask you to do is to be silent. Wait until they start talking more. Wait until they start providing the information that you mutually have agreed is the purpose of your interview. And that is a skill that's very challenging to develop, to not feel awkward in our own skin, but is the most important thing if you want to assume the role of an interviewer. Maybe you have people who are silent. Okay. Now the tables have been flipped on you. They're not answering. They're not talking. This can be a big challenge. A good way to try this, again, is to go back to our probing techniques. Depending on what you're doing, you might say, okay, maybe you can draw something for me. Can you draw me the process? I want to understand, let's say you're asking, what's a typical day like at your work? And they say, this, and then you try to ask another question, and they say, well, that's it, and they're kind of silent. You say, okay, great, let's try to draw out from start to finish what your days looks like. And please, every time you draw something, explain it to me. Again, these can be challenging things, but what we're trying to do is shift the context of the behavior. Maybe something that we didn't pick up here are people who can be a little dominating or flip the tables on you. Maybe they start interviewing you. I've had this happen a lot. It's very challenging. I think the key thing here is to recognize your role as the interviewer and to pick up on what you can do. And so here you might go back to silence. And if they just keep talking, you might be in a very challenging situation. But what you can do is, as they've become silent, as you become silent and they become silent, you might answer by reestablishing the conversation and say, I think those are really interesting questions you're asking. Maybe we can talk about them after the interview. What I'd like to know is, and you reestablish the conversation in the interview. We could talk all day about people who are difficult and challenging. But one of the things is that we need to constantly be honing our skills to be developing and come across those scenarios to become better at them. Because there's a lot of stuff going on here when someone is telling you information and you're trying to gain that information and learn from it, and also to help that person eventually. Maybe your product can improve their lives. I hope it can. Part of the importance of these interviews, though, is capturing the data. We keep thinking sometimes of interviews just as conversations, but interviews are a science. They're a soft science. They might not include math, but they're a science. And we need to think about that in those lenses. So when you're doing an interview, think about the data you're capturing as well. So your data is in the form of quotes. I like to collect those on pens and paper. But your data also might be the way that they talk about something. Maybe they're saying something, but they say it very quietly, or they rush their words. This is very telling as well. So recording a conversation and information is very important. I also take photos of everyone I interview. Some of you might have seen, I always carry my camera. This can maybe help you link who the person is with what they said, but it can also mean you can take photos. What's in your handbag? May you show me? Or, oh, may you show me that part of your office where you mentioned that thing? That will help you remember what was going on in the interview. I know what some of you are thinking. Got this fancy smartphone. These days, they do everything. It's true. You can take photos on this. You can record information on this. You can even take notes on this. I would prefer that you use a disposable camera before you use your smartphone. Because phones in an interview can be very distracting, not only for you, but for your participants or the people you're interviewing. Even if it's not distracting, it can cause disruption to what is a very important information gathering experience. You know, it could go off, it could ring, or maybe it was recording, but then you got a text message, so it stopped recording. Phones are great, and I love them. But if you want to really seriously start doing your interviews, doing them in ways that can help you get rich information, referring to some of the more traditional tools will really help us understand so that we can then reflect and act. Okay, so we planned the interviews, we conducted them, we did all this research, got all this data. Now what? One of the most important steps of interviews and doing rich interview studies is analyzing the data, or how you analyze the data. And so one of the ways that we can do this is by splitting out the interviews into specific quotes, quotes that make sense. A designer I really respect, a man named John Kolko, has a whole process for doing this. He takes maybe the transcript if he recorded it. He then moves it to an Excel spreadsheet, puts every quote on a different row. Then he prints them out. Then he moves that onto a board so that he can move them around. He can also tag them with what the quote is about. I think that's great, but personally sometimes I know you need to be more scrappy. Maybe you work at a startup. You don't have time to record it and go more. But writing down the key quotes during the interview or after the interview will help you build up a wall where you can start to build patterns from what you're seeing and learning. And building those patterns based on the categories will help you derive the insight. Because what you move from is what someone says, an utterance, this one quote, to a category of things that people are saying over and over again about how they're using your product that can start to help you see the trend that you may need to investigate further or act on. One framework that I've come across working on growth teams that I really like is called FOG. FOG's super easy because it's easy to remember. FOG, facts, observations, and guesses. Facts might be the things you learned about the person that are very factual based. Things that you learned about how they use your product or what motivates you. Observations may be things that you noticed in their body language. So, oh, they were nodding their head a lot when, or oh, did you see they crossed their hands when? This is useful when you're working on a team and you have two people. You start to build up a fog so that you can start to clear up the sky and see what you need to build. Okay, so we've planned, conducted, we've reflected, got all this data. It's now organized. Don't just sit around. You gotta do something with it. But this is important too. Oftentimes, if you work in a business environment, it's very useful to get cross-functional groups of people to actually analyze the data together. So giving them an opportunity to talk about what you're learning can help you then slowly foster the sort of ideas that will get you places. Because the only way to have really great ideas is to have lots of ideas. And that ideas should be based on what you're hearing and seeing from the patterns in the interviews you're doing. A lot of the times what's useful is to build out what we would refer to as an idea pipeline. Again, an idea from Sean Ellis, which is based on the interviews. Maybe we saw a pattern. You describe it. Certain types of people who were doing what with something when led us to this hypothesis. This hypothesis can be measured in this way. If you're a product manager, a lot of the times you already have a backlog. You have a roadmap. But you've got a lot of ideas. When you're doing interviews, whether it's strategic or continuous, making sure that you come back, you reflect on them, you organize them, you categorize them, and then you put them, whether it's on a Google Doc, a Dropbox paper doc, or on just even a note card, putting your ideas down in a structured form based off what you heard enables you to have an ideas backlog that then you can prioritize with your business, or if you're a business owner yourself. And then if you work on a team, you can also prioritize those ideas. So you can do dot voting on what the best ideas were. And you can use lots of different frameworks to do this. So we covered the sort of what I would refer to as the general arc of interviews in this hour and 20 minutes. What I'll say is, in the beginning, we're going to be moving now towards an exercise. What I mentioned was, we're not going to boil the ocean. We can't learn everything about interviews. But what I will say is that getting better at interviews is almost a lifelong practice. So even if you're super familiar with this, try to reestablish what you don't know as a beginner. Try to force yourself to think about these things in terms of those structure, those body language things. Bring those outside of yourself. And we'll be doing that specifically in an activity where you interview someone else. We're going to do that in about 2 minutes. But I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to go grab a coffee or go to the bathroom, because this is like a long thing, and I just threw a ton of information at you. And so we're going to be doing a practice, an exercise, in 2 minutes. So please come back or grab your coffee in 2 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to slowly get started as soon as everybody in the back sits down. So we had a few questions during the break. Some people came up to me, they wanted to have a quick question. They're really good questions, and I want to make sure that I answer all of those questions so that we can hear them all. So I'm going to repeat some of the questions. If you asked the question to me and I didn't get it right, just please let me know. What's challenging about a workshop is you can't put everything in the workshop. Sometimes, it's a little too much, but it's good to ask questions. So if there is something burning that you don't know or you haven't heard yet, ask a question. One of the first questions I got during the break was, what about a framework for doing the interviews? There are a lot of different frameworks that we can use to make discussion guides. Oh, abstract questions here and this thing here. Frameworks are great. Frameworks are a fantastic way to start learning how to do interviews. The more interviews I've done, the more I've learned that I don't know that I want to recommend one framework for structuring your questions. For analysis, frameworks are really good because frameworks help you get a little more concrete. But questions are generative. They should be open and big. And sometimes you need to think about questions in a flow, how they naturally relate to other questions. When you use a framework, what happens is you put the questions where someone else told you. You're not building your own flow. And so sometimes it helps to start by maybe doing something like, okay, I have this question here, I have this question here, I have this question here, I have this question here. I got all these questions. Then you say, well, actually, maybe this question follows this question better. So you list out all of your questions, and then you think about the flow. We talked a little about that. I can bring the slide back up. And this also matters because then what you can do is you can say, okay, here's what I want, or I want to learn, let's say, and here's what I'll do with it. When I learn this, I can do this. Because you shouldn't be asking any questions if you can't do anything with it. if you can't think about how you're going to learn, like sometimes it's, oh, well, when I learn this, it'll help me better ask this question. That's valid. But at the same time, we should be orienting our interviews as actionable, moving them towards something to improve your business. So this is why I don't use frameworks anymore, and why I don't necessarily suggest frameworks for writing out your questions, because it'll ruin and become unnatural the way you ask people the questions yourself. You'll be forced into someone else's way of asking questions. But I wouldn't say that they're terrible. Maybe they can really help you to start. So that's frameworks. Frameworks for discussion guides. Someone asked me also, how many interviews should I do? I think if I had, you know this phrase like, if I had a penny for every, if I had $1 for every time one of my stakeholders asked me that question, I wouldn't have to work at Dropbox. It's a really good question though. So the answer is, I used to be a consultant, and as a consultant you learn the answer to everything is, it depends, but really it depends. Now, how many I do? Well, scientifically, social science researchers have found that 6 to 12 interviews are a good way to start to get what's called saturation. Saturation is a concept of how much information we can take in to be able to get enough information to start to see patterns. If you don't do, say, 12 interviews on a very complicated subject, they're going to be all over the place. All the information will be everywhere. Doing 12 is a great starting number. But what I'm not saying is just do 12 and you'll be fine. Sometimes you need to do 24. Sometimes you need to be 36. Interviews are both a soft science and an art. There's no one right number here, but what I will say is, if you found the right people, if you found them and you're talking to exactly the right people in your cohort who are very specific, say you have 12 people who are all in a major at a university, all who are the same gender, all who have generally the same socioeconomic background, talking to 12 of them will help you see a bit of trends there. If you talk to 12 different students on a university campus, you're not going to understand the university. So you'll have to up the number of interviews you do. A big consideration for how many is how long do you have also. I guess my one recommendation would be is it depends. I can tell you more about my exact recommendation by having coffees, but I'd say do 12 to 24 as a good starting point if you found the right people. And then what type? What was may you repeat the question?
So I was asking about what type of interviews should a company run? Let's say for customer development or validating a new idea or like whatever.
Yeah. I'm very stoked because I get to speak about this tomorrow a little. I think what I'll say though is there are 3 different ways that I think about this, and you'll learn a little more about it. But of course let's just layer on a common understanding that we have: acquisition, activation, and retention. As a startup, there are, I would say, different times, if you're particularly a startup, where you want to focus on different things. If you've already had great product market fit and you're starting to retain lots of users, you have a great retention rate, it might not be as imperative to do some of these retention-based interviews. It might be more important to focus on acquisition or activation, depending, again, on where you're at in your startup. The difference here is I might interview people around what was necessarily challenging for them when trying to use the product. And what I might learn by doing these interviews is the context of where they tried it, how long they took to try it, what was challenging about it. And you might be able to actually get specific people here of people who have recently tried your product but maybe haven't retained. If your product does not have product market fit, maybe you want to talk to those people who have recently churned. Maybe it's people in a 4-week window, people who use the product but stopped using it for 4 weeks. And you say, well, Those people were long-term users. They used the product and all of a sudden they stopped. So there's different types. I would say that at different points in time, if you're a very early stage startup, you probably want to be doing all of them in as much as you can. And this is again where I'd say, let's go back to another thing. There's maybe 3 types of general ways that you might approach research. There's strategic, there's tactical, and there's continuous. Sometimes you want to specifically learn about something because it'll help your company strategy. So we want to learn why people stopped using it. We want to do some retention interviews because that'll help us define our roadmap for the future. Or maybe we're saying, oh, we're seeing drop-off rates in our onboarding flow. We want to improve the new user experience there. So we're going to do a series of activation interviews to improve that. But generally, everything else is OK. And depending on, again, if you're a very early startup, maybe you just need to be doing lots of interviews. And you'll be doing them in each different types of buckets with different types of people. Unless I know more about your every specific business environment, it's hard to say. But there are different types. Layer on your understanding of the funnel to think about them and prioritize them accordingly. Any last questions before we do our exercise? Hi.
The question is that okay? The planning stage is clear. The purpose is to plan it in the best way, right? The interview process. But is that okay to change the plan on the go if you understand that some questions are like...
Yeah, of course. So, yes, definitely. Like your roadmaps, I hope you don't just follow them blindly to a T. We react to what our customers are saying and doing, and we change and we get rid of our roadmap when it's not working. Think of your script like a roadmap in that sense. It helps you feel very prepared. It helps you communicate that you're ready and you know what you're doing. But the more you do interviews, the more you can use probing techniques to change it on the fly. Or maybe you do 1 or 2 interviews and you realize a number of these questions are no good. I definitely would throw them away. Definitely be adaptive, so don't follow them blindly. We do all of this planning to feel more confident and feel ready to do these interviews.
Do you have some like tests for your execution plan? I mean, like some test interviews, how your questions sound to people, do they get them? So how you check whether your plan is okay?
Yeah, definitely. I think if you start, so when we're thinking about how we test our questions out, if you're relatively new to interviews or maybe you've only done a handful, it could be very useful to try them out with a colleague or to practice by yourself even. I think the more interviews you do, the more comfortable you'll feel. I myself don't do any tests anymore of my questions. I feel very confident in the types of questions I'm asking and the way I'm asking them. And that can come from experience and learning, but also sometimes being ready to, I have a script and I get rid of it. And there are a lot of different, we looked at, and I think you have on your tables, asking the right question, all the different types of questions. I find for me with more time, I'm very familiar with every type of question we can ask. And so I'd say testing is a great idea. Like anything, quality assurance can be important and matters. But I wouldn't belabor it. Sometimes you just have to write off your first interview. Best way to try to start doing it is to start doing it. And what I would love to encourage everyone is to start doing these interviews more and thinking and planning them. So it can hold you back sometimes if you're too worried. We can ask more questions after. Let's get into some of the exercises. I want to do one fun thing first. Who likes to garden? Does anyone garden? Wow, no, man. I know when I'm getting fucking old when I'm like the guy who's like, I love gardening. Sorry?
We are farming.
Yeah.
Going farming.
Gardening. There's a gardening show on the States, and this guy, he interviews people. He's kind of like Anthony Bourdain for gardens. Let's watch him ask a question, and you tell me if you think it's a good question.
The Parisians have been buying that house I come here to meet Didier Group, to find out people in Paris are growing today. Bonjour. Bonjour, monsieur. How do you Just a little. I understand that you've been working here for 3 generations.
Yes, from here in this shop, from my grandfather, we arrived in 1929 from the Massif Central to sell some plants and beans and seeds for people of Paris.
And do Parisians like flowers? Do they enjoy flowers and buy a lot?
They buy flowers in Paris for French people. They prefer to buy plants like this with flower. And well.
Okay. What was bad about this interview? How did it go?
Closed questions.
Closed questions, okay.
He also advised the response.
You advised the response, yeah, okay, what else? So,
Asking about the experience of other people.
experience of other people, yeah. Anyone else?
He didn't tell anything about himself.
Okay. No rapport building, okay. What was good about the interview?
He was polite.
Polite?
Smiling.
Smiling, yeah, great body language.
He was interested in his story.
Yes. This man is both a fantastic and terrible interviewer. And I love him. He's great. But he's great because he's so genuinely interested. And it comes across. He really cares about what's going on. And I would encourage you, if anything, to do that. If you genuinely care about what you're here to learn about, I promise you'll get a lot of rich information. But what he did do is started with a closed question. He did something that's called leading the witness, which is, oh, you know, I understand Parisians really like flowers, right? So he's not going to get the most honest and best information. Instead, he might try to ask a little more about what are the favorite types of flowers for your customers today? What is the most popular type of flower that you sell? And of course, to your point, he asked about other people, not about this man's experience. Again, some interviews can be good, some can be bad, they can be hard. What I'll say is that the only way to get better is to practice. And so what I'd like to do is have us practice. So I'm going to give us a prompt to do that. But let's first start by saying and counting off 1, 2. So if you can go, you're paired with your person next to you. You don't know them. One of you decide, maybe you're 1, you're 2. So in your seats, one of you is 1 and 1 is 2. Does that make sense? Yep. Great, easy. So what we're going to do is, we're going to count off, but everybody's paired off. This is you pairing off. Okay. So we're going to Okay, come on back. What we're going to do is a bit of interview exercise. So what I'd like for the people on number 1 to do is, and these are some sample questions, and you also have what I printed out for you is interview tips. But what I'd like you to do is we're going to spend 8 minutes. I'd like you to write a discussion guide, a very basic one. If you're number 1, what your goal is to identify their favorite show. And the reason that we're doing that is by identifying a favorite show, you can understand media habits because maybe you're building an online lifestyle consumer brand. Or you want to just better understand for your streaming application what's easy or hard to use about the current one or the way that they currently watch TV. Again, how you structure your interview doesn't matter to me, but what I want you to do is identify their favorite show but build an interview around that. So build rapport, learn a little about the different aspects of it, try to ask a few different questions. Now, people on number... Sorry?
It's relatively easy. You gave it step by step what you asked.
So I think, yeah. So I think that if you think that this is exactly how you do an interview, then we're not on the same page.
Oh, I mean, you gave the goal and the probable steps.
Okay, let's take it a step back. Your goal is to identify their favorite show. Of course, this is in a perfect environment. But the reason that I'm also saying that they should know about that is, the flip side is, we also talked about being a difficult participant. This gives someone a chance. What we're going to do is, one person will interview and the other person will be the interviewee. Sometimes you might give a little easier of answers, but sometimes you might hold back. Maybe you answer a little soft in a different way. What I think we'd like to do is to just practice trying to write out what are a few questions you can ask that help you understand who they are, what they do, before just asking, what's your favorite show? Because that's not the best way to get that information. Maybe there's different ways. So what I would encourage you to do is take this as inspiration, but then try to make it your own and do it in your own way to learn from that and see what's kind of hard or challenging about that. For the second person, we're trying to learn about the last digital product that they bought. And again, as I mentioned, try to build rapport. So, how you do that is up to you. Maybe you want to ask specific types of questions on who they are and what they do. And then you want to move to your open-ended questions. And then you want to better understand how you could learn more about that. And so again, number one, your goal is to identify their favorite show. And the wider goal of that is to understand their media habits. And number two, you want to find out the last digital product that they paid for. Here you want to better understand what types of apps they have and why. So these are your wide goals. Take 8 minutes to write your discussion guide, and then we're going to do practice with each other and flip. So just take about 8 minutes writing down your sort of loose guide and script.
So we would work with pairs, yeah?
Yes, pairs. Oh, so you're...
So, yeah.
Help me find a pair.
Does someone not have a pair? Who does? Yaroslav, may you pair with this gentleman? Great. You're welcome.
Should we do it in English or Russian?
Question was English or Ukrainian or Russian? Up to you. Hi.
Can you switch please to the slide with the guides?
Oh, I'm going to leave.
Inspiration? No?
Let me ask the group and see. Okay, let me take one last thing. Who wants the last slide up for inspiration? Only a few people. Okay. It's a hard thing. Some people want the inspiration, some don't.
8 minutes for preparation?
Yes.
8 minutes for...
8 minutes for preparation, and then I'll come back.
Okay.
I'm going to let you do it on your own a bit, and then I'll put up the inspiration after other people write it. 8 minutes to write yourself your general script. This should be a silent exercise, writing your script. Okay, so the way that we're going to do this is, now that everybody has written a discussion guide, we're going to have each person do the interview. So like, for example, number one is going to interview number two, and number two is going to answer. And answer honestly. Don't make something up. Don't fake it. Tell exactly how you would respond if someone was really interviewing you. And now, the one thing I do ask that maybe you don't fake, but that you might want to throw in if you want to help them practice is, maybe you only give a one-word answer. Or maybe you don't know how to respond to it. That might be helpful, but you don't have to. Try to just be honest in your answers, though. And what I will say is, we're going to be doing this interview for about 8 minutes. Because sometimes, the reason why that matters is, sometimes you go to people and you said, I'm going to interview you for 20 minutes. And I'm going to give you something for free in the product. And you think, oh, I got all the answers I need in the first 10 minutes. Should you keep doing the interview? Yes. Yes, I think that you should. The reason is that we have so much to learn from people. We have so much to learn about their habits, their behaviors, their motivations. And if you've identified that this is the right person to talk to for some reason, you can learn much more about them. So maybe if it's, say, like a retention interview and you wanted to find out why someone stopped using your product, you might find out in the first 10 minutes. But you might then want to parlay it and understand what other products do they use? Why do they use that? When doing that, it'll help you learn about what makes that product sticky to them. And you might be able to uncover and learn from that information and data. So I know we're all busy, but when we plan to intentionally do interviews, we should do them in the way that they're set out to be done. That's just my personal take. So let's take about 7 or 8 minutes. Start with number 1, person number 1. Go through your interview. Introduce yourself. Frame it up. All right, 1 minute. 1 minute. This is you slowly ending your interview. I will speak very slowly until everyone is silent. Hi. Cool. Well, thank you so much for playing that game with me and taking time to practice. Again, I'll underline that the best way to become a master or expert at interviews is by doing a lot of them and getting really into this framework of thinking about the structure of your interviews, thinking critically about the types of questions you're asking, and getting chances to utilize probing questions and finding yourself in very unfamiliar or sometimes challenging environments. So who has no favorite TV show? Does anyone have a favorite TV? Great. How did those interviews go for the person asking the questions? Well, what did you learn about him? What did you learn?
Same topic, actually. I have learned that Sergey do not usually watch TV at all, but he recently bought a TV. Recently, yeah. That usually he doesn't watch some content via TV that he prefer, because usually he watches TV with his kids and family. But for himself, he usually watch different YouTube channels and have even subscription for, I forgot.
Amazon Prime.
Yeah.
So
Amazon
why
Prime.
doesn't he watch TV?
Like, because TV is at home, and at home there are kids, and usually he watches what kids prefer, so I don't know the motivation. You're not able to choose the content.
Okay. It's okay. So we'll stop there. What about in terms of what about his favorite show as a kid?
I don't know. I was focused on the content that Sergey prefers as his end user.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm alluding to is there's lots of information and ways that we can learn about things for people. And I think depending on where you're at, sometimes you're a startup and you have a new idea you want to bring to the world. Or sometimes you're in an enterprise where the business has decided this is what we're building and we need to figure out how people are going to start using it. And sometimes taking lots of different ways to ask questions and learn about things with people can really help us understand the ways in which they use them. You know, people, when the Palm Pilot came out, said no one wants to use a small device. And I think then 2 years later, iPhones came out. You know, we need to think about why people like one device over another or what they're doing with them. We need to spend a lot of time learning about them. I guess who created a script or who wrote out their script? Everyone? Yeah? Who followed it exactly? Okay. Anyone? Okay, you followed it pretty exactly. Who jumped around all over the place? Yeah. And then what about who maybe asked a question that wasn't on the script? Yeah, nice. So this is where like we need to probe, we need to ask different types of questions. I think, what would you say was easy about an interview like this? What came naturally? Someone? Anyone? We'll go maybe to the back to someone who hasn't spoke. Thank you. Yes. What were you going to say? What about you? Thank you very much. Person was very open. Lots of information. Okay, great.
Yeah, in the middle of interview, I started not following my script as I got the context about the person, and I started to create usual questions, and it was really interesting for me to ask those questions.
Right. Okay. What was hard? What challenge did anyone face, if any? We're going to go one here, then two there. So we'll start with you.
So it was difficult to keep in mind the process because when you like jump into the flow,
yeah,
you need to listen and to think about questions in the parallel.
Yeah.
So it's hard to keep in mind those things.
Parallelizing questions. What else was hard? What was challenging? Right. Okay. What else?
Actually, the same point is that limited time makes you ask faster and faster, and you have no chance. Like,
yeah.
To make notes.
Yeah.
What else? Yeah.
Given the understanding of the interview,
Yeah.
kind of makes people say like the conclusion right away.
Yeah.
But in fact, some interesting details hiding, like what you're asking, not the direct questions, but some relevant information, and
Yeah.
you understand that it's not very aligned with what people are saying in the beginning and what is actually. Like, it's hard to, you should concentrate on continuing asking that questions, like some relevant questions.
Yeah. The details of that.
Yeah, because at the beginning it can be tricky.
Yeah. So these are good challenges. These are real challenges that pop up. Sometimes we interview people that we know or are very like us, or it's very interesting, and suddenly you find, oh gosh, you're not focusing again. And so getting on those pathways and giving yourself a structure, making a guide, maybe listing out some probing questions beforehand can help you check yourself. Sometimes people will give you an answer very directly to what you had already worked on. I guess sometimes you're with a colleague and they go, oh, okay, great, we're all done. Focusing and remembering to probe can be very challenging, but that's what we're trying to do here, is to encourage ourselves to do that. And a lot of the times, interviews are just too short. Sometimes someone, you had thought 20 minutes would be enough, but they told you 10 minutes where their life story, you said, tell me a little about yourself in 1 or 2 sentences, and they said their whole life story. By the way, that's another way to deal with a difficult participant. You might say, tell me in 1 sentence or 2. You give them the framework. There's lots of them. Anyways, what I'll say is, again, there are a handful of tips, but this type of workshop is the beginning of a sort of journey. So we said back in the beginning, this is the beginning of a journey. This is sort of you trying slowly up to continue moving. I think that with art forms like interviews, the best way we do them is by reflecting on them and coming back to workshops like this. Even if you're like an expert, putting on the beginner's mind, the beginner's hat, can help you remember what kind of questions you need to be asking, kind of help you refocus yourself. And in 3 hours, you can only learn so much. So what I'll definitely say is there are great resources out there. Some of these I had mentioned in some of my favorite books, but Steve Portugal is a luminary in this subject, fantastic man. He writes Interviewing Users. Talking to Humans takes more of a customer development lens, but still has some great and interesting techniques. But what I wouldn't be shocked is that, there might not be necessarily 100% new material here either. What you'll find is there's different ways of presenting and interacting with it. So what I would say is, go forth. do interviews, get excited about them, be genuinely interested in those people. And when you do these interviews, try to come back to what we've learned here in the ways that, either the many different types of questions you could have or the different structure that you take on your approach, and reflect on the process. What went well in that interview? What did I do good? What could I do better? Because that's how you'll get a little better. So to end, I'd also recommend that you pair your data, your interview data, and this is what I'll talk about in the talk tomorrow, with your analytics, with your surveys. When you see drop-offs in your flow, rather than just trying to optimize the screen, figure out why first. Maybe do 6 or 7 interviews with very specific users before even coming up with your new solutions. So again, thank you so much for taking time. I really appreciate all the questions, and I'll maybe end with 1 or 2 questions as we hit to time. Who might have 1 or 2 asked questions? Yes, please.
I have a small question. It's very important for, I think, most of that. It's about recording.
Sorry?
Recording.
Recording the interview, yes.
It's two-part questions. Like, first, do we need to say it's over?
Yes.
Are you okay with?
Yeah.
And because sometimes
what's the second part of the question?
The second part was the same, like if you're doing remote interviewing, do you need to start video first?
Yeah, great question. And actually it was on my notes in the slide. And may look like everything goes up here fine and natural, but it can be very anxious speaking to 50 people you don't know. So sometimes you don't address all the things. What I will say is the biggest thing that we didn't get into, and that I'm so glad you asked about, is the ethics of interviews and the importance of not only with recording, but giving and asking for permission with that. As you saw in the photo I had, I always put it down and ask people because it is in a present space. And that also extends to photos. Whenever we take photos of people to bring back to the office, we want to ask for their permission. Again, there's a whole sort of art form and science to asking for consent. In our business, we have what are called consent forms. We ask people to read about the information of what the interview they're doing, and then we ask them to sign it. Sometimes in a startup context, that's a little less important. But that's again where we would frame and why I underlined saying the purpose. The reason that, hi, my name is David. I'd like to conduct an interview with you. The reason I'm doing this interview is X, Y, Z. And you might have also framed that up in your recruitment email. Is it okay that I record the conversation? It's very useful to me because it'll help me remember the conversation. And I think also just on the note of ethics, when we're talking about being genuinely interested, I think that I'm really passionate about information like human intelligence and interview data, because I honestly think that when we really care, like the garden guy who is super passionate, when you are really passionate about that, when you care about what you're learning from someone, you will make your product better because you'll have that passion. And people, like your users, they'll notice it too. They'll be stoked about the fact that you care and that you've listened to their feedback, to what they were saying, and that'll rub off. So thinking about not trying to take that information and use it for dark patterns of, oh, if we did this, we could just change this and it could influence people to do that. But what do they need? What do they care about? And how can we help them is really important to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I have one more question, right?
Sure.
So the question is, how do you check is this particular person you're talking to is relevant to your case?
Yeah. Very good question. Challenging question. I think it depends. Earlier we heard someone reference, maybe, I told you, that's why I warned you. I gave you my consultant hat. But it really does. Let's go to when you look at your customer data, your segment behavior. Sometimes it's very important you say, okay, well, we want to talk to people who churned, who stopped using our product. It's important then that you only get those type of people from your customer database and that you spend time with them. And then when you're building rapport and you're using those factual-based questions, what you're doing is establishing trustworthiness and credibility. You're trying to learn a little about that. I had a story once where we did some research and, before Dropbox, and we were doing research about people who had tried the product. You know, we had got the information from the customer database, and everyone we talked to, you know, asked for examples. They didn't try the product. What we learned is we had a logging issue in the product, actually. We had a logging issue of how that they had been captured. And that is sometimes good information in interview data as well, which is, oh gosh, there's some other problems that we didn't even know about. Interviews can lead to other information. So I'd say your factual-based questions, your rapport helps you establish, should I be taking the rest of the information and using this? And sometimes you do a whole interview and you say, I'm not going to revisit that transcript. It's not worth it.
Adding to this question, do you ask the person sitting in front of you, okay, do you have such a problem? Or you think it's not an okay approach? You got it?
May you say it another way?
Okay, so the person is sitting in front of you and you're conducting your interview, right?
Yes.
And you guess that this person is relevant for you, right?
Yeah.
Because you saw the data, survey, and so on.
Yeah.
And do you ask, I used to ask this person, okay, do you have the problem I will be talking with you right now, just to filter?
So I think that that relates to what's called screening. So sometimes before we do interviews with like larger populations, depending on where you are, like in places like Dropbox, it's a little more robust. We will send out a small survey to people before we do interviews. We don't necessarily ask, do you have this problem? But we would ask them to describe the problem to us, or we might ask them, you know, how frequently they do something, and then we would exclude them from the study if they answered the survey by saying, you know, if you say, for example, oh, how frequent is this a problem? And you're looking for people where it's really a problem. And they say, you know, instead of saying, is this a problem? You might say, how frequently, you know, does this occur for you? And you'd say once, you know, multiple times a week, multiple times a month. Then you will prioritize who you talk to and you will exclude the other people. Sometimes you do it in the interview. Sometimes you do it through like a survey or email to kind of exclude after. Okay. Go this way, and then I'll come back around to you. Yeah.
Yeah. After we conduct a bunch of interviews, what is the best way to structure the information and find like global patterns, like in order to conduct like more interviews in the future and find more patterns?
So let's take this case, going back to analyze. If you had, for example, recorded all your interviews, or maybe you had written down really good notes. In John Kolko's case, right? You take the transcript from the audio. There are a lot of services today, like rev.com and others. You can get the transcript. From the transcript, you might pick out some key quotes, to your point, like around the topical area. Maybe you're looking for information around activation. And so you were asking people about the sign-up experience. How did it go? What was challenging? What other competitors do good sign-up experiences? Maybe not the question you'd ask. You'd put all those quotes into your Excel spreadsheet that are relevant to this study, and you might then develop a series of categories or patterns that you've learned from them. And then when you're analyzing that, I think then the question becomes, how much information do we need to act? What are we trying to do? Are we trying to optimize the sign-up flow in a certain way, or are we trying to learn about what motivates people? I'd say that you will feel, this is where the kind of art of interviews comes in. When we think of saturation, a lot of that is based on intuition. So we say, okay, I've done 24 interviews, and I think I know exactly what's going on here. You should trust yourself to then make that decision to move forward. There are some frameworks for how you might do analysis or do categories. I'm just a big fan of what's called affinity mapping. Again, so that's where, if you want to learn more, there's something called the KJ model. You can look that up. But this is, again, where you get on all these different stickies, you're organizing them into categories, and then you know that you have a robust enough way to take action on what you need to do. So in the case of, like, say, someone who stopped using a product, you might want to say, okay, we've done 18 interviews. we have a series of hypotheses now that are not rooted in our own assumptions about why people stop using the product. Now we can do a large-scale survey to everybody who's ever stopped using the product. And we can use the learnings from the interview to inform the survey to see how prevalent what we thought the problem was. So you just keep learning. It's like a learning cycle. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, sure.
We'll go here, then here, and then, oh, and then here, here, and then there. So, cool.
So the question is, when you get this data from interviews, all of these are facts, and then when you analyze it, there are judgments.
Yes.
Facts and judgments. And you make some interpretations how to avoid misinterpretation, and how to avoid mistakes in this exercise, maybe some rules that you use.
Yeah, of course. Really good question. The best way to kind of do that is to literally get a transcript of that data. So like when you're doing your interviews, getting a transcript of that data and working, especially if you work with other people, if you've done these, say you're doing the interviews as a part of a project with your team, you might take all the quotes that you think are important from that interview and you have someone else pull all the quotes they think are important. Do they match? Why or why not? Then when you're looking at those quotes, we might look at one and say, you know, what does this mean to you? How do you interpret this? So in a business environment, it's useful when you're working on a team. That helps you to get out of it. When you're by yourself, it's very challenging. I think what I often do is I try to look for patterns that are not in my own words, but are in the words of the participants. This is referred to in the social sciences as in vivo coding. And this is basically what you say is you stop looking for your own patterns. And when you're reading the transcript, you start to look for the words that they say. So say you're looking again at retention and churn. Maybe when you're asking about why people stopped using the product, every time they answer that question, you start to take a phrase from what they said. So they may say, oh, you know, well, it was just really a heavyweight process. You might take the word heavyweight, and that might be one of your stickies. And then if you do 18 interviews and everybody was saying the word heavyweight, this might not mean, heavyweight might not mean slow performance. It just, the word is heavyweight. Then you can look at it and you can analyze it and say, what are all the different meanings of heavyweight? Because you might already have an opinion to say, ooh, it's slow performance. You know, that's what they meant. But what you're doing is you're trying to use their words to try to pull it out. But I will end by saying it's a very hard challenge. I think constantly reflecting in the moment about why am I making that judgment? What is going on when I'm making that judgment is very important. And the other thing that I'd say is if you're concerned about that, start like what I would call a journal, interview journal. Write actually how you're feeling about the interview, about what you think. I know, you know, for some people it's not natural, but putting your stream of consciousness onto a piece of paper and then looking back at it can help you make your own biases very aware of it. This was one here and then one there.
Okay, I have a question about churn. So when we have exit interviews and people who agree to take part in them as well as to answer survey, I have an assumption that they don't care, that they care still about their project. If they spend like 30 seconds to answer the survey and something like 20 minutes to have an interview, they still care. My question is how to track the people who don't care so they won't answer any survey, they will never participate in the interview just because they don't care.
Yeah.
I will also add that people who hate the product, probably they will still go on the interview to tell how much it sucks. But the ones that don't care, they will never answer your email. They will unsubscribe, they will contribute support to delete their account.
Yeah.
But there's the most important, there's a fixed majority.
Yeah. Churn interviews are some of the hardest interviews, and everybody wants to do them. You know, why don't you like me? Why don't you like my product? I get it. It's hard. It's very hard, but they're important to do. I think what I would say is this is where incentives matter. This is where you might say, listen, I see that you there's really creative ways to get to it. Maybe you'd say, I'll offer you, and it depends on how important to learn about this is. If say you're a startup investor or a startup founder, you've started your own business, you've invested all this money, I would see doing this research as another investment, and I would offer people money to understand why, and I would try to learn from that. And doing expert interviews should help you do that. Asking really good questions should help you see, and you'll see it as an investment. Or maybe money is not an option there, but you see, for example, they use a certain type of product. You might be able to offer them access to that product via your network. You see they use someone, you know someone through something. There's a lot of different ways I can get into that, but that is very hard. That is why incentives matter in interviews. That's that.
David,
yeah.
Please share your experience regarding, after you conduct the interview and analyze everything, and then how do you present the results to the team? How do you store the results of the interview, and what artifacts do you store and keep updated?
Yeah. I will give an answer that does not give justice to the larger picture of that. I think the purpose of this workshop is interviews and how to conduct them. How to do effective design research inside of a large organization is definitely another workshop we could get into. But what I will say is you'll see a bit of that tomorrow as well. Storing data. It depends. If you're a startup, the way you store your data will be different than if you're an enterprise, how secure and how private it needs to be, if you've taken transcripts or photos. I think that right now, the way that we do it, and what I would encourage everyone to do, is we store it on Dropbox. It's a great product. So we take our transcripts, we do store them on Dropbox in very secure and locked folders. We anonymize everything. So we take people's names off of all of the things. We usually don't show photos of people's faces. I work in growth. And the way we present these findings is we usually, I mean, preferably the thing that is important to me to do is not say, 3 out of the 6 people in the interviews said or did this. These are interviews. These aren't surveys. This isn't analytics. You don't need to use numbers. You don't need to prove anything. I think what you need to do is refer back to the human emotion about the challenge. Share the person's story. I interviewed this really fascinating person. Maybe if you have photos, this is a great way to tell the story. I went to their business. This is who they are. This is the quote about the way that they use my product. And this is why I think we need to make this decision, because we heard in 18 interviews the majority of people saying a similar thing. And that can help you tell that human story. That can help your engineering team or your design team better understand where your idea pipeline is actually coming from. We're going to go that way. If you want to, is it a quick question, a follow-up? Okay.
And do you present this to your whole product team, or it sounds like only for product management and design and so on?
Yeah. In your environment, it'll differ. I think that for me right now, Dropbox is a heavily collaborative, cross-functional place. So when we do workshops, it's the whole team all together. We have engineers, product managers, designers, because we find that gets the best cohesive design forward, because we're all on the same page and everybody is motivated by what we understand to be the problems. I would also indicate that it helps everybody understand the context of the problem. I have worked in different environments where maybe I only work with management. So I've done the interviews and really I'm only presenting to the CEOs or the heads of, or maybe it is really only the product managers. I would say that the best times that I've done interviews is where I have a cross-functional group, no matter what level they're at, so that they can, especially in a product environment, so that we can tackle the problem all together and that we can know where we're going. Because if we know where the idea is generated from and we know why we're building something, we'll all be super passionate about fixing it and fixing that problem. So I'd definitely not say that this is only for product people or only for designers. I'd say learning from other people is for everyone. So. Well, maybe one last question. Oh, wow. Okay. I'm just going to do these two and then we'll call it. Okay, yours is on. Yes?
Okay. Question about fashion. You say that if you you're really interested when doing this interview, a question about this. What would be your suggestion if I'm not really passionate? Like first example, the gardening. I don't care about gardening.
Yeah.
I don't like it, don't love it, and so on, but I need to do research about filters.
So
should I just cancel it?
Yeah.
I'm doing saying they're not passionate, should I talk to those people? I hate them, and so on.
That's a good question. Yeah, I think for your in a different business context, I think I've worked in places where I'm not necessarily passionate about the product. Love banks, love bankers, good people. Not necessarily the most passionate about like learning about finance. It's not my passion. At the same time, I think that we don't all have the luxury to work on what drives us and what makes us passionate. I usually try to only work on things I care about and that I honestly can stand behind. And when I'm doing that and when I'm doing research for it, then I get excited and I am passionate about that because I want to learn more about that. And I think that if you're not necessarily passionate, say, about the concept of gardens or gardening, I think what I would encourage is to give rise to a healthy curiosity about the world. Because I think you asked a question about biases and how we stop our biases. The more we're very curious about everything else happening around us, even when we don't care anything about that, when we're really curious about it, we can ask so much better questions, probing questions, learning questions, and we can then use that for the things we are passionate about. And so I think that I will say, become very curious. Whenever I read, sometimes I like to read those like motivational leadership blog, books and things. Who's the famous person that said, "Stay hungry, stay curious"? I think that's the thing. Like the most successful people I've ever seen are super curious about things they don't even care about. So I'd say just stay super curious. Last question.
Dennis, I see that you are providing a lot of interviews, and you are listening to so many people.
Yeah.
And I believe that you have as much voices inside of your head as all do songwriting. So my question is, what makes you to be happy?
What makes me happy?
Yeah.
I get happy, I get stoked when people get curious about other people. And I get very happy when I get to watch that gardening show. So because usually it means I get to have a glass of wine at the end of a day and I'm relaxed and I've done my job.
Yeah, but why? Why do you think that it makes you happy?
We've done our job. All right. Thank you so much. Okay. Feel free if you want to come up, grab me for a question. I'm also, I am literally not on Facebook, but I am on LinkedIn. So feel free to reach out to me. Always happy to help people try to learn more about these subjects, get more curious, find the right articles. So I really hope that you've had an opportunity to learn one thing. And I want to thank you again for coming and spending 3 hours with me. So thank you so much.
Thank you.